Rojin, will you be able to share the screen? Because we gave you control of your slides. So if you could do that, then share your screen if possible.
Oh, sure. Give me just a second. I thought that the slides that you guys needed them ahead of time to include it in your deck. So give me just a second and I will grab mine.
So welcome everybody to the part 2 of the BCI conference. And we will have a couple of presentations. And the first presentation will be from Rojin Eichler West from the Pacific Northwest Lab. So go ahead and share your screen.
Like I mentioned, I thought that you guys were going to present the slides. It's going to take me a moment.
I can't hear you, but if you're having problems with your mic, put something in the chat. I can hear her though. Did you give her access to? Oh, there's a chat. She's unmuted. So when you're ready, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
And share your screen, please.
Okay.
I do not know why you cannot hear me. Huh? Hang on a second. Did you unmute her?
Only the presenter.
Yeah, she is a presenter.
Yeah, she. Yeah, she has to. She has to. Okay. Yeah.
To be concluded.
Rojin is unmuted.
Rojin, you're unmuted. So
yes, I know.
Try
Can
again.
You hear me now?
Oh, let me check this.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe. Of course. Of course. Okay.
Okay. Try again. Can you say something?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, now we can. Yes,
okay,
I think it's on.
Fantastic.
Wonderful. So it's on our end. But are you going to share your screen?
Yes. You couldn't hear me a minute ago, but I was saying that I thought that you guys were needed my slides ahead of time because you were going to present them. So it took
That's
me
okay.
a second.
So now we gave you control of the of the screen, so you're able to do it.
Thank you. I had to find them. So now I'm okay. And let me.
So go ahead and share your screen.
Can you see the screen?
Perfect. Yes, we see it on the screen now.
Okay, wonderful.
And you can put it on full whatever the slideshow mode or something. If that's okay. Yes.
Okay, sure.
Wonderful.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Okay.
And please introduce yourself to the virtual audience.
Fantastic. So my name is Regina Eichler West. I'm a research scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. Prior to joining the lab, I spent nearly a decade working with non-invasive BCI in a clinical psychology setting where BCI devices have been used in neurofeedback for decades. So during this time, I have observed the emergence of a plethora of consumer BCI devices, including a growing DIY community. However, compared to clinical amplifiers and headsets, the data quality of these wearables has been relatively poor, and end users are typically poorly trained in acquiring clean signals. There's also been growth in the number of clinical databases to identify biomarkers associated with the dysregulation or of disease states. And universities have been sharing public repositories of BCI data most recently, which has been encouraging the application of machine learning algorithms for biomarker discovery. However, unlike the recent turning point represented by technologies such as ChatGPT, which owe their success to having consumed a vast corpus of open source text-based data, the volume, quality, heterogeneity, and pre-processing requirements of BCI data are such that predictive algorithms are still in their infancy. Despite this, there have been fears expressed at well-publicized meetings such as Davos that BCI technology is headed towards the ability of governments and corporations to monitor thought. Well, it is true that there are currently some Chinese elementary schools that require students to wear BCI devices all day so that they can monitor whether these children are paying attention. There have also been some companies in the US who are moving towards similar monitoring of employees, especially in critical roles where cognitive fatigue could pose a threat. So it's fair to say that there are certainly ethical and social issues of consent and control associated with compelled monitoring. However, the fact is, this current generation of devices is only capturing relative states of vigilance and is not capable of decoding thoughts or intention. Studies that have yielded decoded words, letters, or images have done so through highly controlled experiments with hundreds of repetitions. And these results are not yet generalizable to anyone other than the individual from whom the data was generated. So while mind reading is far from a threat today, my understanding is that the purpose of this meeting is to assess the landscape of possibility with respect to security concerns that might be addressed with export controls. Consequently, it's my recommendation that the Department of Commerce monitor technological advancements in these three areas. First, the emergence of new kinds of sensors, especially those that might collect data in a non-consensual capacity. For example, there's one company in California that claims that they've developed a non-contact BCI device. Although details of how they've achieved this remain proprietary, it's worth keeping an eye on. Second, important to keep watching, is the emergence of single trial decoding algorithms. Now, this is one goal of the current DARPA NEAT program as they seek to identify preconscious indicators of one's personal beliefs. When those two have reached maturity, then we're going to need to have more concerns over the ability of third parties to monitor our internal states, particularly those associated with thought. Now, thirdly, I'd like to bring up something that we should really be concerned with yet today, and that is how secure are BCI radios, especially in implanted devices. Now, edge devices and the Internet of Things is a huge area of national security concern. Now, certainly implants are not cell phones or internet routers, yet I'm going to give you a crazy but true example on how seemingly innocent devices might be exploited. So just a few years ago, there was a cybersecurity incident where a North American casino was attacked by a hacker in Finland through a radio-enabled fish tank thermometer. Yeah, that's right, a thermometer sitting in the middle of a casino. They gained access to the thermometer because who would think that a thermometer is going to be of any consequence? But it was through accessing the thermometer, which was internet capable or Bluetooth capable. It was possible to access the casino's databases where data stored about the casino's high roller gamers was able to be acquired. So here are my questions that I think that we should consider. Could someone in the military with an implanted device, whether it be for either medical or performance enhancement goals, inadvertently allow a foreign actor to gain access to adjacent networks? Could they hop through that implant to get access to nearby networks? Another question is, if they had any sort of a radio implant, would they still be allowed to go into a SCIF, a secure facility, where typically bringing in things like cell phones or computers or other kinds of radio-enabled devices is just not allowed? Could they be compromised by foreign actors should those foreign actors recognize biomarkers of depression, neurodegeneration, or perhaps issues with impulse control? Could that be used then as a form of blackmail? And then finally, could their geolocation be tracked from this implanted device? So I think that these are more important questions today than whether or not we're reading people's thoughts. We need to keep our eye on all of it, but I think that's a more immediate concern. So many of my other comments indicated on this slide have already been addressed throughout this meeting, or as I've come to realize, are not directly focused on arguments governing the question of what is a security issue and how can export control be used to help mitigate that issue. So I'll only mention briefly and then in my remarks, and that is that several concerns, well, there have been a number of people at this conference who have really focused on ethical issues, and I think that that is incredibly important that we're having that conversation now. Several concerns expressed by clinicians I know that use non-invasive BCI is that they're concerned that private companies collecting data are not subject to the same HIPAA regulations that the clinical community is, especially in the commercial or the performance enhancement area of commerce. And this is especially troubling when part of their business model might be to offer screening devices to insurance companies. Let's see, also the conversation yesterday and today didn't include a discussion of import controls. Now, there've been several international companies making significant innovations in the non-invasive BCI space, also in the development of clinical databases. So while we haven't had the conversation yet, I think we need to differentiate between partners of the highest regard with respect to a common goal in advancing brain science, especially towards medical solutions, and those who may be attempting to enter the US markets with malicious intent, especially with respect to the radio issues mentioned prior. With that, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts with you today. And thank you all for listening, and thank you, Betty and folks at Commerce for allowing this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Rojin, for your presentation. If there are any questions online, please write it in the chat, and I'll read out the questions for Rojin. While we're waiting for that, I do have a quick question. How advanced is some of the technologies that you're talking about? Is this is the research being done in government labs, or are they being done in companies right now?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know the relationships of these companies and their governments. In terms of cutting edge, I would say the best in the world right now for non-invasive BCI devices. G-Tech out of Austria is really pushing the boundaries with the products they're bringing to market. Their wearables are much less susceptible to the kinds of movement and muscle artifacts that we associate with most of this technology. In terms of developing clinical databases and really having a very engineering-focused approach to the collection of event-related potentials, BMedic in Switzerland is very, very impressive in that regard. HBIMed and IMED iSync out of Russia and South Korea. Again, I don't know the relationships to those governments, but they've invested quite a bit of energy into developing clinical databases that in both cases, actually, they're normative databases, meaning of these different biomarkers, how far away from the mean are their values of the particular individual. And for psychologists, this helps them to understand what kinds of cognition, emotion, or behavior may be out of balance with the rest of the brain. IMED, I think, is also targeting now specific kinds of brain maladies. For example, right now they have a dementia database, and they're going on to build one in particular for depression. Science Beam from China is quite interesting. About 3 or 4 years ago, they started reaching out to just about every clinician I know, asking whether or not people would be willing to be an internal to the US representative of their products. I have not used any of them. I have not known anyone who has used any of them. I'm just recognizing and reporting that there are new players trying to enter the US market. And, whether friend or foe, we should probably get to know them and find out a bit closely what they have to offer.
So if that's the case, do you know, like these companies that you're talking about, are they undergoing some clinical trials in their own countries, and whether they're close to getting approval and so on?
Let's see. So GTech is not so much clinical. They tend to focus more on a cognitive science market. BMedic does collaborate quite a bit with groups in the US to do clinical trials on event-related potentials. HBI Med, they already collected most of their data for event-related potentials, and in QEEG, I think their data is probably now maybe 5 to 10 years old. They seem to be a company that is somewhat in decline right now. A number of folks I know have a lot of trouble with their customer support for help on new versions of their software. iMed iSync is continuously gathering new data. Primarily, their model is that you upload data that you've collected to their database. You may give them some information. For example, maybe you've done other sort of psychometric testing, and you share that with them, or you share with them that you believe that this person has a diagnosis of something. And then they use machine learning in order to extract what plausible biomarkers might be. As for Science Beam, again, I'm not really too aware of what they're doing, other than they made that really big push about 3 or 4 years ago to get clinicians in the country to be representatives. So I don't know if they're doing any clinical trials. When I went to their website last, they also offer a number of more academic type equipment that's targeted more, say, at rodent studies or cat studies, some sort of animal models of brain function.
Oh, that's really very interesting. So, on a slightly different topic, what is the let's say your government labs, what kind of research are you all actively involved in? And if it's not classified, I presume, and is it still at this basic research type of thing, or it's close to maybe a transition to commercialization already?
We're not at a state of potential commercialization. When I joined the lab, I was part of the lab 2004, 2008, then I left to focus on BCI, and I just came back last year with the idea of being able to develop a machine learning program to be able to, well, 2 things. We applied to the DARPA NEAT program to look at biomarkers associated with preconscious signals. We're also looking at applying to some Department of Defense, the congressionally directed medical research program, to be able to do better predictions regarding head injuries in soldiers. So I would say that the focus right now is on developing better machine learning algorithms to be able to more accurately and effectively identify biomarkers, and transparently, I should say. One of the big issues with machine learning right now is that it's often a black box, and we don't have a good understanding of why it is that the machine classified something as it does. With clinicians, this is a big problem because they want to know, what is it that I look for in the data, even without your big fancy machine, and it needs to really match their intuition before they're willing to accept the predictions of something like a machine learning algorithm. So while we can use it to advance discovery, it still is an issue that we need to be able to then interpret that data in a manner in which the domain, in this case, clinicians, are comfortable with. So the short answer is machine learning as applied to a BCI type data.
Okay, that's good. So in that sense, if it comes to a stage that machine learning and maybe the algorithm, or maybe a combination of all of them, algorithm, software, and machine learning, would it, how do you kind of like separate it out from, oh, this is strictly for medical use, or this is strictly for other users? I mean, because I'm sure that's a commonality, right? I mean, and if it can be used for medical purposes, it can be used for other purposes as well, right? Because it would probably be the same program that is being used in this type of devices.
You're absolutely right. The data is what it is.
Yeah.
And it's whether you're interpreting it for a medical purpose or whether you're interpreting it for a cognitive purpose. I'll give you an example of how murky the line is, and this is just within the clinical field. So looking at brain signals, if you find these uh, types of markers associated with epilepsy, if you're a psychologist and you see that marker, it is outside of your scope of practice to make any kind of comment about that. You have to refer that client to a neurologist, and only they can say what that blip in the data means. So you're both looking at the same data, but you're only allowed to comment on a particular aspect of it that's covered by your licensure. So now if we broaden that to what can a person that has a background maybe only in commercial devices or cognitive science say, well, they're not bound legally by a licensure. And so they can, I suppose, make whatever comments they want without any sort of repercussions. So it is an issue that, who can say what about the data? And let's see, I think on the other hand, that they're looking for different things. So a person who is interested in depression, for example, may be looking at, is there an asymmetry in the front of the brain where one side is hypoactive and the other is hyperactive? They're in particular looking for that biomarker. Whereas someone interested in, say, performance aspects of the brain, or let's say decoding words, they're looking in a different area of the brain, and they're looking for something that's more time locked to an event. So location, location, location in the brain, where a particular function is located is both distributed as well as having an epicenter when you only have a few electrodes by which to pick up that signal. So it is the same data, but it is what you're allowed to comment on. It's where it is you're looking, where in the brain you're looking, and at what time scale you're looking. And what question you're asking is going to be the lens through which you interpret the data.
Oh, that's actually there's a lot of food for thought. Would you that's interesting. For the virtual audience, would if anyone has any questions, feel free to type it in the chat box. And so while we're waiting for that, I'm curious to find out if let's put it another way. If the algorithm, software, and all this is that critical, like for two-way communication between a brain and a machine, let's say, in the case of how do you think are the risks for cyber hacking if it comes to that?
Let's see. So with respect to just the example of side channel attacks or uh, I think that's a pretty that's a risk right now. In terms of if you're asking something a little bit more sci-fi, like can we influence someone's thoughts? I think that's an open question, and I think it would be a little bit irresponsible for me to speculate on that. Where we receive information, the sensory parts of the brain are certainly different from the motor parts of the brain. And so our ability to do that, again, is really highly dependent on where those sensors are implanted and what work has been done in the past to be able to decode from that particular area. Whether or not simply the act of having an electrode array in an area, um, as the brain adapts to it, could this cause types of anxiety? Could this impact networks, especially those associated with impulse control? I think that remains to be seen, but I think you've asked a very important question.
Are there any other questions? If not, thank you very much, Rogine, for giving this informative presentation about the potential use of BCI from your perspective. Thank you
for the
again.
opportunity. Thank you.
So our next speaker will be James Giordano from Georgetown University, who will give a presentation on BCI. So James, if you can hear me, can you please share your slides or share your screen?
I can hear you loud and clear. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful, wonderful. Let me make sure I can actually share my screen with you.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can do this through a window. I think so.
I think it's at the top part of the screen of the Microsoft Teams, and there's a next to the leave button, there is a share button.
Okay. Can you see this?
Yes, now I can see you and I can see your screen.
Okay, great. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to expand the presentation just a little bit. I mean, we've been talking about brain computational interfaces and their potential role, but I think we need to be a little bit more broad. Look at brain-machine interfaces that essentially run the gamut from those things that are able to assess the living brain characteristically at this point in real time and remotely, and then those things that can use that level of assessment to access and affect the living brain. Just for curiosity, ma'am, how long would you like me to present here? I can tailor this to however long I've got.
You can take as much time as you have, because I think right now there is only 2 virtual presentations. So if you want to keep the audience enthralled, feel free.
All right. Well, I don't know if I'm going to keep them enthralled because
time.
It's 14:30 on a Friday afternoon. It's happy hour somewhere. So we'll try to keep it as happy as I can. So I think one of the big pictures that we need to consider with regard to the entirety of what we've been speaking about for the past 2 days is the whole impact of how many of these neurocognitive technologies and the science are influential to gain purchase, and in that way leverage to what's now been called the international or global bioeconomy, and specifically the neurobioeconomy. To give you an overview of where we stand with what these techniques and technologies are capable of right now in 2023, and appreciating that here in the United States, utilizing the Heilmeyer Catechism, a very forward, fast-acting organization such as the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, for example, is able to articulate a relatively fast actionable traction of these technologies literally from the drawing board into some application within 60 calendar months, 5 years. Now, what I hope to show you is while that certainly is impressive, it actually is not fully remaining apace with our international peer competitors who've invested considerable amount of time, effort, and financial support, as well as the unification of their governmental resources, their research resources, both on the academic side and on the industrial side, and the industrial military complex to be able to accelerate that timeline to 40 calendar months. So we're talking about a 2-year differential. That 2-year differential is significant because what it does is it leftwardly shifts the scientific and technological readiness level of those things that are therefore scalable, fieldable, and operationalizable in a variety of applications that range from strict biomedical applications, which I'll talk to you about in a moment, which can yield some interesting purchase in the bioeconomic capability and distinctions in terms of research tourism and medical tourism, as well as putting these things into a variety of uses in public life, as well as in operational military intelligence applications. So if we just take a look at the broader picture of what brain-machine interfaces are right now, what we can see is these are parsable into 3 relatively stable categories that are in no way mutually exclusive. You have the assessment neuroscientific and neurotechnological engagements, which include things like peripheral and central monitoring, various forms of electrophysiological recording, neuroimaging, and concomitant brain mapping that goes along with this to be able to find viable targets, not only structurally, but functionally, so that we can actually map the biophysics of where in the brain we can intervene. One of the questions that came up at the latter part of the previous speaker's discussion is, well, can we write into the living brain? And can we therefore evoke some kind of cognitive control? The short answer to that question is yes. It's really just more a question of dialing in the granularity as to the distinction, specificity, and precision of that cognitive control. And in fact, that's one of the hallmark features and an intended goal of a current DARPA project called N-Cubed, Next Generation Non-Invasive Neuromodulation, that posits the ability to utilize nanomaterials as active sensors and transmitters to be introduced to the living brain via non-invasive means, inhalation, injection, gastric swallowing, and then dispersion through the bloodstream, to then be vectored into the brain utilizing certain forms of, at this point, confidential means, primarily using some form of electromagnetism that creates a particular spin in these nanomaterials, forms them into DARPA's phrase, vast arrays of sensors and transducers and transmitters that are capable of reading from the living brain in real time, remotely, and writing into the living brain in real time, remotely. If in fact it was,
James,
yes.
may I interrupt? If you
Sure.
want to move your slides, I mean, you can
Yeah,
control your
no,
slide.
we're still on the same slide. That's fine.
Oh,
We're just talking
okay,
about
all
the
right,
assessment neurotech.
okay, that's
Yeah,
fine.
so
Thank you. Sorry.
so let's be colloquial for a moment. If we consider that what the brain does cumulatively is engage thought, emotion, and behavior, in addition to its autonomic and physiological controls, those 3 constructs, thought, emotion, and behavior, are what we define colloquially as mind. So I don't care how you shake this down, what we're really looking at is mind control and mind reading, literally reading. In other words, taking one set of symbolic signatures, whether these are data forms essentially digitized, that are then translated into some type of digital to analog representation of what's going on in that brain, using that in an interpretive way, and then using that interpretation to essentially affect change back into that system. So we're reading and we're writing into the living brain. We can also do this on a variety of levels, from the genetic level all the way up to the expressive phenotype level. Now, what does this essentially mean? Well, let's think in a bit of military terms. And I hate to use bellicose terminology when describing things that are biomedical, but I think we need to, because we talk about individuals such as the late Raquel Welch, who lost a brief battle to an illness, combating disease, fighting and targeting. That's what we're doing. We're targeting things. We're developing accessible targets that can then be effective and influenced through these technologies. Brain machine and brain computational technologies. Well, what are the interventional technologies? They're here before you. You can see them. Peripheral modulation, such as vagal nerve stimulation, various forms of downable and doffable forms of transcranial electrical and magnetic stimulation, directable forms of energy that are capable of modulating node and network activity to the brain in a non-physically invasive way, but in an energetically invasive way. And here I think the invasive distinction becomes almost a moot point when we're talking about having a downrange effect. And then, of course, indwelling brain stimulation, both invasive as we know it now, and minimally and non-invasive as the near iteration, as well as neuroengineered implantables and a variety of prosthetics. Now, where do we locate these things on the interventional spectrum? Well, a couple of different ways. If we're using these to treat identifiable pathologies and injuries, well, then that's right of bang. In other words, some bang event occurred, an insult, an injury, and we're using this in such a way to diagnose and treat that injury towards some form of recuperation. But that's not the overall goal. The overall goal, as we know it, as we come to be recognized by a variety of the funding programs that we've punched into over the past 10 years, utilize the acronym HOPE, H-O-P-E, health, operational and occupational protection, and enablement, enabling the individual who is getting this brain-machine interface to do what it is they do or want to do better, which is sort of a fancy way of saying optimization, which is sort of a politically correct way of saying enhancement. So we're able to work both left of bang in ways that may be preventative, augmentative, and in that way increase resistance, resilience, and possibly recuperative capability, and right of bang, once it hits the fan, to put things back together and perhaps, as the old $6 million man thing says, well, to make them better than they were before. None of this is sci-fi. I've been a neuroscientist for 42 years this year. The past 15 years have been virtually exciting with regard to the almost linear developmental growth that has been infused by large-scale investments in the brain sciences and engineering, not only here in the United States and among our economic allies globally, but also among peer competitors, and the distribution of those products to peer competitors' proxies, both in developed nations as well as the effect they will then have on developing and non-developed nations with regard to relative balance of capability. Over and above this, one of the ways that machine interfaces are capabilized or force multiplied is through the use of what we call ancillary means, big data on a variety of scales, and the use of machine learning, decision technologies, and AI. But I think what does become important to understand is the prior point that I strove to emphasize, which is that the United States and its international economic, as well as perhaps military intelligence allies, are not alone in the enterprise. Certainly, what we see is there are large-scale, huge financial investments of national capital in the brain sciences and technology. And as we see here on the map over to the right, these are only those countries that have invested billions of currency units in these types of brain projects. There are several others that have invested millions in these efforts, and these two are working at least in some sense cooperatively and in some cases competitively. But if you notice, what you see is a large scale.
Excuse me,
Yes?
James, can you move your slides to slide 3, I think, that you're talking about?
Are you seeing slide 3 now?
No, we're looking at slide 1, and I don't think you're in the slideshow mode.
Yeah,
So
I am. It's telling me I am, but I can tell you what's happening here. So
okay,
let me do
because it
let me do this for
froze
you
at
real
that
quick.
point. Yeah,
Yeah, you
that's
gotta
why
love you gotta love Teams. So hang on just a second. Let me rush through these, and I think I can fix
take
it
your
for you.
time.
Stand by. So let me do this. Can you see this now? Give me a second. How about now? Share. Come on now. Boom, boom. Oh, you gotta love this. Browse my computer. There we go. You know, one of the things I got to tell you about, I guess this is Teams or Meets, is that it really gives people a lot of heartburn when they're trying to do this kind of thing. So let's just see what else we can do here. All right, let's try this one more time. File is in use. Yes, dear, I know the file is in use. Boom. Okay, let's see if we can see the slides now. How about now? Anything?
Not yet. Nothing is showing. We can see your own screen. your face, but we don't see your computer. Let's
Oh,
put
this is
this way.
ridiculous. Well, it had share a moment ago, but it's not letting me share now. So whatever. Let's try one more time. Let's try this. How about now?
Hang on a second.
Anything?
No.
Nope.
Uh, well, rather than waste everybody's time, how about if you just take a look at my ugly face? Can you see my face?
Yeah, we can see your face.
All right. I can send you the slides. I don't think it's really necessary that I present
Okay,
the slides. It's going to give
it's fine.
people. Yeah. So I mean,
Yeah,
I'll just talk to you off the cuff, and if you don't mind my New York accent, if you don't mind looking at
that's
I have a great face for radio. So as long as you don't mind, if you're just
yeah.
for here to hear the voice, I'm happy to like take my camera off if anybody is completely repulsed.
No, it's great. It's great.
All right.
We like the camera
So
on. So go ahead. If you
so
like a
one of the issues that we're
conversation.
facing, so one of the issues that we're facing is that these things represent fairly large-scale multinational investment enterprises. And the ones that we're really concerned about are those that are primarily of our major international peer competitors. And the one that is most overt and not necessarily somewhat clandestine or playing cards close to the vest is China. They have a huge brain project in China. That brain project seeks by the year 2025 to be one of the leading players on the global stage. Yes, that's only 2 or 3 years from now. And by 2030, their director, Dr. Moming Po, has stated that China seeks to be one of the, if not the world leader in translational neurotechnologies. Now, of course, the issue here is that it's predicated very strongly upon intra-national needs. China has a graying population. Part of that graying population is faced with growing neurodegenerative disorders that are somewhat consistent with an aging population, and we recognize this. However, what also becomes important is something I alluded to earlier, that when we're looking at the triple helix that occurs between government entities, the research entity, and the commercial and industrial entities in an authoritarian government such as China, this is relatively seamless. In other words, it's not a question of dual use, where things that may have dual use need to be identified as such, as they are here, for example, in the United States and among many of our international global and research allies. Not at all. The usability is multifold. It is what we call multiplex utility going in. Anything that is developed in the research enterprise is perfectly applicable towards any direction and any effort that is therefore governmentally sanctioned and funded seamlessly. Moreover, one of the interesting phenomenon is something that China practices called lawfare. It's one of the, if you will, three, quote, warfares or engagements that China has very, very publicly come out and stated is part of their non-kinetic engagement on the global stage to leverage relative hegemony. Wink, wink. It's a nice way of saying power. But it's quite true. And there's a tremendous amount of power that is leverageable in them, their neurons, because we can affect not hearts and minds, but minds and hearts, the bodies and the behaviors that go along with it in a variety of ways, as we've seen over the past couple of days. But I think what becomes important to understand is that Chinese intellectual property law is well positioned on the global stage to create an omnibus of capability and effect for China as a national entity in the bioscience and biotechnology realms, among others. So, as a brief aside, just to provide you an example of same, if in fact a non-Chinese national is recruited to or is solicited by and therefore is attracted to China to engage in research and development, testing and evaluation, anything that that individual does in China represents Chinese IP. By the same token, if a Chinese national is here in the United States working at a United States university or a Canadian university or European university outside of Chinese geopolitical borders as a Chinese national, 100% of that individual's research by Chinese intellectual property law is Chinese intellectual property. And here's where it gets a bit dicey. Any investment that China makes governmentally or through a governmentally subsidized or approved financial and philanthropic entity in a foreign effort, enterprise, or commercial engagement, if it is a majority share enterprise, then therefore greater than 51%, it's Chinese intellectual property. So one of the things we're seeing is that there's a very strong omnibus of effect on the global stage being leveraged by our near-peer Trans-Pacific competitor. Our transatlantic competitor operates a bit differently. They play their cards a bit closer to the vest, and by playing their cards somewhat closer to the vest, therefore maintains something of an ambiguity of what's actually going on in research laboratories and how those research laboratories might be affecting, disseminating, and therefore leveraging capability outside of geopolitical borders. And interestingly here, I think it becomes important to also have a direct comparison with regard to gross domestic product and national investment. If we take a look at Russia, for example, they're somewhere between 25th and 48th with regard to international ranking as regards to scientific technological investment in this space. China, on the other hand, depending on the index one uses, is either number 2 or number 3, and positioned in terms of current statistical trend analysis within 3 years to be number 1. So the sheer economic capability that is leverageable in the brain-machine interface dynamic by our near-peer competitor, I think is important to then speak to what has sometimes been referred to as the economic golden rule, which is the entity with all the gold rules. Now, I can tell you from my own experience, and there may be others who are around the table with you there who've had this experience, and if so, please pardon my redundancy if they've already brought it up. But a number of years ago, I had the privilege and honor of participating in the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, Office of Science and Technology Directorate's engagement with global Neurotech. And it was just that. It was a roundtable. And the roundtable brought to the fore some of our Trans-Pacific competitor colleagues. And their statement was rather clear. What they said is, look, we are a rising force in this for a number of reasons, not least of which are intra-national biomedical health and public health interests, but also it becomes very important to understand that as a rising world power, one of the key dimensions of their capability is in biotech and bioscience and tech combined, neuro being one of those. Neuro not being a singular entity in this case, but rather representing what is now known as an integrative scientific convergence. If we look at what neuro does, I mean, I've been a neuroscientist for decades, and I can tell you there's something of a relative disconnect that occurs between individuals who are doing cellular neuroscience and those individuals who are doing social neuroscience, from those individuals who are doing something on the synaptic level to those who are doing on a sort of the self and sociological level. And when we're dealing with brains, clearly we're also dealing with those brains that are embodied, and those bodies exert behaviors in a variety of different contexts that range from the quotidian all the way up to the international and cosmopolitan. So if we look at neuro as an exemplar, what we really see is that neuro is nothing more than an advanced integrative scientific convergence that brings together a variety of different physical sciences, natural sciences, and anthropological and social sciences that are directable to any particular silo of influence or disruptive effect. And when I say disruptive, what we're really talking about here is disruption of the status quo. What we mean by that status quo is the regnant balance of power, as well as the narratives that control said power. Break, break. Why is this important to our discussion today? Because if what we're considering is multiple usability, where dual really stands for a variety of application silos, and if what we're also dealing with is a peer competitor for whom multi-usability, multiplex utility does not need to be specified in any granularity or particularity, but represents the entirety of their research translational effort, all of it is multiplex utilizable, then what we're seeing is that that peer competitor represents, at least in pace of spectral effects, something of an advantageous competitor. In other words, they have the advantage. Why do they have the advantage? Well, if what we, the proverbial we, are trying to do is to segue things from these various silos of use into those that may be leverageable to gain purchase in key domains on the global stage, so as to counterbalance these neurobioeconomic effects in and across their domains and dimensions, inclusive of things that might be hard power, political power, financial power, military and intelligence power. Well, we're a couple steps behind. Why is that? Why are we a couple steps behind? Well, I'll tell you one of the reasons, and this is something that was explicit in those discussions around that roundtable back in 2016-17. Western culture philosophically, since the Enlightenment, has advocated a multidimensionality and an appreciation for cultural diversity and cosmopolitan recognition. I mean, it is axiomatic to much of Western philosophical doctrine. Our peer competitors, our trans-Pacific peer competitors, rightly have stated, yeah, that's a great doctrine. And you love to thump your chests about that until adherence to that doctrine and practice what those doctrine things preach puts you, or as we used to say in my own neighborhood in New York City, all yous, meaning all of us, at some type of disadvantage, whether that disadvantage is economic, social, military, or across the range of potential balances of power. Then suddenly we stamp our fists on the table a la Khrushchev in the early 1960s and say, no, 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 there is only one ethics, and that ethics is Western. That's anathema to Western philosophical doctrine. Further, the reality of that is that the enforcement of a single ethic denies the reality of what may be seen as communitarian good. In other words, if I say that I want to do something because the low-hanging fruit for me to use some biotechnology like this is my definition of good, that may not be your definition of good. Furthermore, your definition of good might actually impugn mine. Oh, come on. Even if we're saying, yeah, but wait a minute, what about military and intelligence things? I mean, if what we're looking at here is the possibility of not only enhancing one's own personnel, but perhaps doing so in ways that we might view to be ethically opprobrious, distasteful, immoral on a variety of levels, and perhaps even illegal according to our law. Well, what they're saying is, how dare you come into our house and tell us what to cook in our kitchen and how to decorate? Well, I mean, certainly we can go back to say what goes on in fill in the blank stays in, but it doesn't stay there. That's the problem. The problem is it's disseminable by virtue of deliverables and demonstrated effect. Furthermore, the issue is that it is leverageable in terms of diversified power. And the issue then becomes, how is it that we can then compete with that? Well, one of the things that goes along with that is their very, very frank, realistic, and defensible statement that long-term trends in culture, for example, Chinese culture, very long-term trends, are equivalent to, or in some ways equal with regard to their profundity and gravitas, to those things that have fueled so much of Western cultural philosophy and ethics. We like to espouse things about virtue and the good and the idea of viable act and rule utility and a duty to be fine. All of these things are hundreds, if not more, years old, ingrained within our culture. But if we look to Chinese culture, they espouse identicality. Identicality, whether it's a Buddhist tradition, a Confucian tradition, and certainly being then fed through the lens of what is their political values desiderata since 1949, which is a communist lens, which clearly brings together a longstanding collectivist mindset in a geopolitical forum. Good for them. It is good for them. How then can we come back and say, well, it's good for you, it's not good for us? Yeah, we can make the statement, but the issue then becomes, yeah, really, what is the good? But what about military stuff? What about the dual usability of this? You can use this left of bang to enhance your people and make them better, fill in the blank, soldiers, warfighters, spooks. You can monitor your individual in the commercial industrial sector, in the academic sector, and in so doing, provide not only information back to the government in ways that we might see as intrusive, or if not actually confronting our civil liberties, but the right back into suggests mind control. And we find that completely anathema to anything that would stand within the Western ethic. Or do we? The other issue then becomes, what if it's not just a question of what you do to your own, but what if these things also allow, as we've seen in the recent literature, and I can tell you based upon my work for the past 25 years, the viability to use the brain sciences and technologies as viable weapons as means of contending against others is real. It's quite real. No sci-fi. The tech readiness level of what these things can do dictates what perhaps they should do or should not do and what that means. But let's not forget, folks, show me a nation, show me a collective that marches off into some engagement, kinetically or non-kinetically, really thinking to themselves, we're the bad guys. Didn't happen. So even if we say, no, we only want to use, as Curtis Bell has said, brain science and its technologies for good, we then have to hearken the question of the moral philosopher, Alistair McIntyre. Really, who's good? What rationality? Which justice? And then how do we adjudicate that good in those levels of discussion to be able to reach some balance when in fact we look at many of these techniques and technologies and it is non-malum in se. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's not as if we're making some deadly pathogen, although we could, for which there is no cure. That represents a whole other area of bioscience and biotechnology, designer pathogens, precision pathogens, that my colleague Diane DeUlis and I have written about extensively over the past decade. That's real. We can do that. AI generated algorithms for new chemicals, new toxins, certainly new genetic and phenotypic combinations that can make new microbes or modify existing microbes through the use now of gene editing, as some of those may be neurobugs. But the other issue then becomes, over and above that, what about those things that are simply good to advance the collective? And how will we then match up against that when in fact, the underlying ethics that provides the basis for moral constraint or permissivity of our trans-Pacific near-peer competitor differs in some ways than ours. Not in all, but some. Definitions of human dignity, definitions of what is allowable on the individual, definitions of what represents viable good given a collectivist mind frame. Essentially, what we see is that what this has done is created an environment whereby relative ethical norms and standards have facilitated a more rapid pace of research capability and translation. So the question for us is, how do you deal with that? How do we sort of stump our breasts and fight for right and freedom and at the same time keep our honor clean? Do we stoop to conquer? And what happens then when there is that strong impetus towards both research tourism, which is quite real, not only in terms of many of our international allies, our German colleagues, our English, our French colleagues, etc., but even within the United States, there are NSF and NIH-funded programs that underwrite ongoing research in China. And of course, we're aware of those intellectual property distinctions. The question then, are we mobile enough? Are we flexible enough to be able to recognize and be prepared for these burdens? I won't even call them risks or threats, these burdens. The burdens that are arising in and from the differential aiming at what one group versus another considers to be benevolent and beneficent ends. Come on, the entire entity of contemporary bioethics is based upon judgments at Nuremberg in the doctors' trial of 1946 and 1947. And although we love to point our finger at those nasty Nazis, let's not forget that in 2 world wars, the German army marched off to war with the words Gott mit uns on their belt buckle. God's on our side. God's with us. There is no national entity or perhaps even non-state actors that may work as proxies or independently that view themselves as the bad guys. Whether working left of bang or right of bang, the justificatory rationale is that this is to advance a defined good. The question is, how do we then balance those goods and adjudicate them in these types of international discourses? One way forward is not to simply discourse, but to engage a true dialectic. In other words, we have position A, position B, and part of these have to be ripped down so that something new builds up. A German word, fancy word. Feel free, it's Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. You're going to be cocktail hour, a couple of hours. Put your pinky up in the air and drop this bomb when you're having your next martini. It's called aufgehoben. It means literally to build, having built back up again. But what are we looking to build back up again? I think what we need to build back up again is a re-examination of import and export treaties and regulations, as well as the parameterization of what constitutes multi-use viability of concern, not just dual use, multiplex utility in and across each and all of these domains. Now, in some cases, this is going to require relatively deep surveillance. And as you might imagine, some of that deep surveillance might have to occur in a way that is less than transparent. Why? Because there are indeed firewalls that are in place based upon intellectual property laws that are internationally tenable, by the way, that may also prompt some revisitation, if not revision, or at very, very least discussion as to the relativity and relative value of these newly developing IP laws with regard to a global stance in the changing narratives of what will then be the power dynamics of the bioscientific and biotechnological economy. But if we go one step further, I think it also becomes incumbent upon us to do three things. Number one, revisit, revise, and perhaps revamp existing international treaties that deal with biological toxins, chemicals, and weapons to include, as the Australia group has done since 2016 at the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention, devices and engineering, which heretofore had not even been on the radar. The other issue is that the language of those particular treaties is not inclusive enough so as to be broad-reaching to capture the wealth of what the neurosciences are able to do as relates to brain-machine interfacing in and across all of those dimensions that I mentioned to you earlier. That's a linguistic revision. Language is great. Words are cheap. Putting words into action is where the rubber hits the road. Each and all of these things have to be entertained as being actionable items, which then requires not only a dialectic, but some form of engagement with our international peer competitors and cooperators. What does that new model look like? Well, I can tell you from our own experience, it's not going to be the model that it was before. I mean, we're dealing with something which is referred to as the three-body dilemma. It's not just a question of, well, here's a superpower, or here's one or two superpowers, and there has to be some relative balance and equilibrium with regard to domains of effect, capability, and hegemony. You add that third body to it, and I don't care whether you're talking about physics or whether you're talking about global geopolitics and all of the ramifications therein, inclusive of those things that are economic, bioeconomic here, as well as those things maybe military, or simple influence with regard to narratives, norms, and standards. It's one of the projects that we're now starting to work on with the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Group of the Joint Staff of the Pentagon, the idea of looking at these constructs of international norms as part of the changing strategic landscape, primarily in science and technology. But let me tell you what that's going to take. It's going to take a recognition, number one, of the capability of our peer competitors in this space. Number two, it's going to take recognition of the fact that there are distinct norms that may in some way create distinctions and differences in capabilization and constriction. And we have to make the decision as to this is an area we wish to tread or not, and what that means, whether we look to stoop to conquer, or whether we look to conquer or remain apace through some other provision of philosophical, ethical, and practical application, and what that may be. I'll throw you a possibility. One is something called cooperative competition or coopetition. In other words, realistically, we cooperate on key areas that will then feed specific domains and dimensions of the competitive differential that allows hegemony, purchase, and balances of power to maintain relatively in such a way that accommodates the three-body law or the three-body dynamics. I didn't make the word up. It's actually in the dictionary, coopetition, and there are some dynamics that go along with it. In our research group, we've proposed literally a methodology, a logos, a rational accounting of methods that might be viable to achieve not only the means, but the ends, which is that relative capabilization of three viable bodies in this global space, in the bioeconomy and the leverageable bioeconomy geopolitically. One such means is taking a look at a type of reflective equilibrium. For those of you who have like sort of philosophical bent, you go, John Rawls. For those of you who don't, you go, all right, reflective equilibrium sounds good. What does it mean? It's just that. We reflect to gain some equilibrium, and that equilibrium has to be a dynamic equilibrium. In other words, every time that the variables change, you don't want to get knocked on your fanny. The Rawlsian approach, now I'm going to get a little philosophically fancy, is far too static. It's not dynamical enough. Real word, dynamical enough. It needs to be. So we've advocated something called a Thagard equilibrium. And for those of you who are interested in what this means in terms of the actual go-by and protocols, shoot me an email. My email is james.giordano@georgetown.edu. I'll tell you again before I end, which is in 5 minutes. The other thing that we can do along with that is to also equate this with some provision of what may be referred to as maxi-min or mini-max distributions. In other words, maxi-min is that the maximum effort goes into those areas that have had minimal attention. And mini-max is minimizing those risks, burdens, and in some cases harms, while trying to maximize benefit. Maximizing benefit may need to be relative and reciprocal to any and all of those parties involved. It took me a whopping 17 seconds to say that. Putting it into practice, yeah, good luck. But it's going to take that level of dialectic. It's going to need to be a work in progress. Why? Because if what we're looking to do, the proverbial we, whoever we may be, is to retain at least some capability, and if you will, leverageable purchase and power on the global stage, whether it's bioeconomically, bioscientifically and technologically, or the applications of that bioscience and technology in either non-kinetic or kinetic domains of potential engagement for power redistribution, then the fixity of that purpose is going to demand flexibility in method. Some things may need to change. Some things may need to be worked to change. It's going to be a work in progress, a work towards that progress. It's going to require that the United States and its allies describe and define a viable strategic goal and plan in this space. We don't have that. I can tell you from my own experience on the Hill, we don't have that. These things tend to devolve into partisan perspectives, and as a consequence, a durable strategic plan that is sort of bipartisan adherent evaporates in the ether, irrespective of whoever is sitting in the seat, which incidentally changes every 4 to 8 years in contrast to our peer competitors. There needs to be some adherence to a strategic plan. That strategic plan has to be oriented towards that purpose, that fixity of purpose. How you get there, what you do with it, well, fine, but those tactical moves cannot in any way sort of interfere with that overall purpose. And what that really speaks to, in conclusion, is the need to engage not just a whole of nation approach, as certainly cohesion of government approach, but a whole of nation approach within government and non-governmental resources. That whole of nation approach must conjoin governmental resources with the private sector, with the industrial and commercial sector. Not necessarily in a way that is identical to our authoritarian international peer competitors, but certainly that is equivalent in the robustness and efficiency of its effect and capability to remain apace, if not ahead, in what may then become the three bodies cooperative model that's going to realize the 21st century. Work in progress, but it's going to take work. I would argue that the juice is worth the squeeze. For those of you who are interested in what our research group is doing, together with our colleagues in the DoD Pentagon side, internationally with our colleagues at NATO, please feel free to give me a call or email me. I'm also available for questions now, but I don't want to belay the issue and sort of drag you on more and more when happy hour is waiting somewhere. But you can reach me at james.giordano, that's Giord as in Delta A, N as in November O, at georgetown.edu. Once again, james.giordano at georgetown.edu. Order right now, and I'll send you a free brain implant so that you can remain apace with our international. I won't. But if you have any questions, comments, or you want to find out what my group is doing, please do feel free to contact me. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have spoken to you. Thanks so very much for your patience with my slides, and I hope I didn't bore you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for what an enlightening talk. And I'm glad you don't have any strict, what you call this, 10-minute session or whatever, which is great. So it's actually very thought-provoking. And I'm glad, you touch on the white elephant in the room, which is China, which is really our main competitor in, I'm sure, in this field. And so I don't know if you heard some of the talks yesterday or even earlier this morning and all that, but how close with regard to brain-computer interfaces or devices, how close are we to see equipment or devices in use? And I'm not talking just mainly about medical users, because those have to undergo, FDA approval and so on. And so that might take many years. But like in the near future, let's say in the next 2-3 years or even 5 years, when it comes to commercialization of this type of devices, um, uh, from hearing your talk, it seems that China is definitely ahead of us already, and we're at this point even playing catch up. Is that correct? Can you comment on that?
I can. In some domains, the answer to that question is affirmative. Yes. Right? In some domains. In other domains, no. China, as you know, back in 2014, instantiated an organization that is referred to as DARPA Mimetic. In other words, it is their own version of DARPA. Please pardon my Cantonese. It's terrible. The organization, I believe, is called Junkewejiwe. And it, like DARPA, takes on high-risk, high-yield projects, but it has compressed the DARPA timeline of the Heilmeyer Catechism to 40 to 48 calendar months, which is highly accelerative with regard to science and technology readiness levels. So in some ways, they have mechanisms and processes that facilitate, if you will, a leftward shift in their development curves and applications for translation. But then in other ways, in part because of our global network of economic, scientific, and technological allies, we're able to get certain things done in and around that network. So it really is a question of asking the specific question of where they might be ahead and where they might not, what allows them to be ahead in those domains, and what we need to do to at least remain par with that, if not ahead of that. Not necessarily by playing, quote, their game, but by recognizing certain strengths as well as weaknesses inherent to that system that we may then incorporate into our own system within the parameters of our ethical and legal probity. The question of how close we are really, I think, needs to be specific to what type of brain computational or brain machine interface we're talking about. If we're talking about things such as donnable and doffable equipments, transcranial electrical or magnetic stimulation, peripheral nerve and or central nerve, cranial nerve stimulation like vagus nerve stimulators, we have them. Well, are we just using them medically? No, we're not. These are available direct to consumer as well in the United States, and internationally. There is a very strong do-it-yourself community that exists both within the white web and within the dark web. And there is a vulnerability of that community to infiltration by what may be financially capricious actors or nefarious actors. So much so that, as you know, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Interpol are making inroads within that community to at least maintain lines of communication. Not to say that the do-it-yourself community is inherently a malicious community. They are not. I mean, grassroots science is probably next generation science writ large. But maintaining the probity of that, the protection of that community against infiltration within sovereignties that could be threatening, really then falls into public safety, legal aspects, controlling aspects within those sovereignties, because they're vulnerable. The other issue is that availability of those products that could go directly to consumer are not necessarily limited solely by national constraint. One can go to the internet, for example, and acquire products, deliverables of these sorts that match brains to various forms of machine learning algorithms, equipments, devices, and downrangeables that are available outside the United States. Now, the question then becomes, is their distribution within the United States constrained by international or United States law, particularly FDA law, or other aspects of the law with regard to consumerism? It all depends on what they purport to do. It's all in the language. So as long as an extant device does not claim to diagnose or treat a medical condition, it does not need to be seen as a medical device by the FDA. And as long as there's no what's considered to be explicit ambiguity, it's not an oxymoron, explicit ambiguity In the trade language that's used to communicate what this is to be used for and how it's to be used, the Federal Trade Commission need not push back, and very often does not push back on that. So the question here is, what types of things are we allowing to be imported? And is the superficiality of those uses in some ways belying that these uses could be employed for a variety of other different purposes? And the short answer to that question is yes, which once again goes back to my earlier point of the need to revisit, if not revise, some of these existing guidelines, parameters, policies, and laws based upon an appreciation of the sophistication of the technology and the infiltrative nature of that technology into existing markets.
That's a good
That answer your
answer.
question?
Yes, it did. Yes,
Okay.
it does. Um, so on a maybe on a tangential question to this,
Mhm.
how do you think of like the biosecurity risk for this type of devices in terms of, let's say, you know, maybe cybersecurity in that sense,
Yeah.
like it, like if the machine can talk to the brain and the brain can talk to the
Yeah.
machine, how, I mean, how do you mitigate this type of risk? I mean,
Yeah. So the need for what we refer to as biosecurity by design is
mhm,
axiomatic to any and all of these engineering enterprises. I mean, it has to be
mhm,
built into the system.
mhm,
And the biosecurity, particularly the biocybersecurity, has to be flexible enough to be able to maintain that fixed purpose against a field of changing variables and factors that can affect it. We realize that, in fact, the hackability of these systems is varied only by and affected only by the individuals who are trying to hack them. So one of the things we're very concerned about is not whether or not the actual nodes, the computational nodes or the network nodes of the brain-machine interfacing are secure, because there's a lot of ways to render those to be very, very secure intra-nodally. But as we understand, these types of devices as systems that interface with systems need to engage system dynamics of network properties, where now nodes interface with edges to be able to increase the capabilization of what the brain machine interface is able to do. That's what makes brain machine interfaces just so capable, so functional, and therefore increasingly sophisticated. Where the real problem comes, and again, I'm not a computer engineer, that's not what I do, but we interface a lot with those people who work on the biocybersecurity side. And the problem comes that these nodes and their networks are stacked. There's a stackable factor that needs to occur here in terms of layers of complexity and differential layers of different types of information that are being taken either outer brains or fed into brains to allow their relative translatability. In other words, to allow things to be read, literally read, and to be translated back into then have some control. So what we're seeing is that in the stackability is where there is hackability. The nodes themselves are relatively secure, and there are indeed algorithms to preserve that security. But the more complex the node edge network interaction, the more loci there are for potential integration of viable hacking. And this is one of the things that we're very concerned about. And on the policy or practical side, one of the things we've called for was, I think, an absolutely brilliant call to colors that was first advocated back in 2012 by a then law student named Stephanie Kostyuk. She's now an attorney working in New York, and she's not working in biotech any longer, from what I understand, which is a shame, because she wrote a paper that I'm envious of. I think it was a great paper. I wish I wrote it. Her paper was entitled "After Gina, Nina." In other words, after the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, do we now need something similar, equivalent, or perhaps more comprehensive for neuroinformation, neurocognitive information? Kudos and big applause to Stephanie. Yeah, we do. And although Ms. Kostyuk's focus was primarily on the occupational capability to render certain things discriminatory, create biases, and therefore affect individuals and collectives in those ways, neurodata realistically can be far more vulnerable on a variety of different levels. And our group has written about that extensively, not to bore you here, but simply look up neurodata or neurobiodata, look up Giordano, DeFranco, DeUlis, all the usual cast of like the cadre that we play with. We've talked about this for the past decade, in that The need for these force multiplying technologies and techniques, such as big data, not only the engines, but the data themselves, the type of data that are massive, and then the necessary machination and soft and hardware required for the integration of these data into accessible, assimilative syntheses, and therefore rapidly accessible and usable ways, require machine learning decision technologies and some form of what's now being called AI. And the need to stack those things in such a way as to capabilize the neural network in one way that are divergent and in other ways that are convergent in relatively fast, rapid, and accessible time renders them hackable, at least at this iteration. So it is a concern. It's something that DARPA is very concerned about. It's something that IARPA is very concerned about. And as of just yesterday, I had a conversation with a colleague of mine named Dr. Bill Casebeer, formerly of DARPA, formerly of Lockheed Martin, now working with a research institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And what we're very concerned about is that this new dimensionality of information that could be used for neurocognitive intel, NeurInt. We're already at the point of having physiological intel coming from things like smartwatches and various forms of biosensors that can be worn, or now we see ingested, not to mention electronic medical records. But the type of information that is accessible and therefore accessible from these brain-machine interfaces have repositories somewhere. There's some custodial mechanism. There's some provenential mechanism. These things need to be developed to be biosecure by design. Formerly, Dr. Rachel Wertzman and I described what neurological and neurocognitive intel obtained and entailed, and it's multidimensional, not only in terms of the intelligence that can be gathered and utilized by intelligence communities, ours, others, peers, competitors, adversaries, but the way that said intel is able to then create not only definitive aspects about individuals' cognitions, emotions, and behaviors when linked to metadata, but also to do so in ways that are predictive, which then certainly harkens the need for a more expansive NINA, Neurocognitive Information Non-Discrimination Act. So is this a concern? Yeah. Are there some things underway that are appropriating, I think, steps towards the right direction, at least for preparedness and readiness? Yeah. Are they done? Is the bun ready to come out of the oven? No.
Wow, that's a lot of aspects to think about, I'm sure, and I'm sure it's not going to be done overnight, type of thing.
No.
So my one more quick question, and
Sure.
I guess I'll let you go. Is do you foresee more potential users for invasive devices or the non-invasive devices? And I know mainly, I think the invasive devices, I can foresee it as being mainly used for medical, but let's say for the non-invasive type of devices, do you see a wide-ranging use for that? And so the more potential for commercialization and so on?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, for both. Although we tend to put up, if you will, moral and legal and perhaps even personal, socially evaluated firewalls against the idea of non-medical invasive devices. That's
Right.
not universal. It's not. I mean, one only needs to take a look at some of the work and espousals of Elon Musk, Neuralace and Neuralink, and the rhetoric that goes along with that. That's purely entrepreneurial. I mean, it's fictional. It's ampliative. We need these devices in people's heads if we're going to sort of have any chance to stand up against the rise of the machines of the coming Kurt's violent singularity. What a crock. I mean, realistically. But if Elon Musk is nothing else, he's an incredible entrepreneur. And Mr. Musk is less concerned about who picks up the technology in terms of its funding, its support, and then engaging that technological imperative to disseminate that technology in practice than he is about some of the moral, ethical, and perhaps even legal probity that goes along with it. In other words, first active bidder to pick up Neuralink and make it viable on a broader scale for things like cosmetic neurology and neuropsychiatry, it's done. Where is he looking? I'll tell you where he's looking. He's looking to China. Where is he looking in China? 3 entities: Guangzhou Medical College, University of Harbin Medical School, and the first military medical college of China, which is in Shanghai. So these entities have made a strong bid, if you will, for the research use of Neuralink and Neuralace as part of a larger sort of infra-corporate dynamic that will then seek to commercialize them first within China, but then also to open up a market for medical tourism for, if you will, cosmetic or boutique neuropsychiatry. Now, in the United States, as you mentioned, I would be hard pressed to swing a rope over my head and find a neurosurgeon who's going to jump on the idea of implantable neuro devices for boutique or cosmetic reasons. But we are very concerned, as you know, I'm involved with what's called the International Deep Brain Stimulation Think Tank. What we're concerned about is the relative facility of the implantation method itself, lending itself to a broader range of clinical applications. In other words, it doesn't necessarily need to be done as an inpatient neurosurgically, but utilizing some of the advancements in the field, inclusive of exceedingly flexible electrodes that are fluid, semi-fluid electrodes capable of penetrating the brain space and then solidifying as a consequence of the environment to which they're then exposed, makes this thing far more tenable in a range of medical situations, inclusive of occupational preventive medicine and other forms of preventive medicine, where now these types of implantables may be seen as having some preventative benefit against other forms of either pro or prodromal neurological and psychiatric diseases, or to afford certain forms of occupational, whether it's vocational or avocational, protection and capabilization. That's quite real. Of course, the non-invasive stuff has huge capability for a variety of different applications, not least of which interpersonal communications. And much of the technology that's actually being partnered with the DARPA program is based upon InQtel technology. It's communicative technology. So next gen, third gen, fourth gen forms of communication systems may in fact be at least reliant in part upon these types of non-invasive mechanisms to be able to integrate things within aspects of the nervous system to facilitate a far more intimate form of direct interface than heretofore has been possible.
Wow, that is really very, very interesting. And I'm sure after this, we'll probably have lots of questions. And of course, the information is a lot to digest at this point, and especially on a Friday afternoon. And say there's a happy hour somewhere. But thank you very, very much for this informative session. And we'll keep in touch, definitely. I mean, and from the commerce perspective point of view, if the situation ever arises that, yes, maybe we should revisit these type of questions again and to see what may or should not or should be controlled, we will definitely reach out to you, Dr. Giordano, and it's very helpful because we have we need to think of various aspects of brain computer interfaces, and so not just the legal aspect, the scientific aspects and so on, and how it can be applied, but also from at least from the commerce perspective, we do not want to hamper the industry, obviously, because we at this point would not like to play catch up with countries like China, and so if we put too many regulations on a fledgling industry, then that defeats the whole purpose, right? I mean, we want to promote the U.S. bioeconomy. So, and then of course we're in direct competition, and so it's really it's not a simple question, obviously, and it's not there is not a one answer, one size fits all. I mean, it's not that. So we definitely have to consult, for sure. We have to consult with academia. We definitely have to consult with industry itself, and anyone that has some have done research in this area, or even with our own agencies like DARPA and all that, to get informed, to have an informed decision making. Let's put it this way. So
Again, I thank you each and all for your attention. As I said, I hope you found it at least informative, maybe interesting, and perhaps even a little entertaining too. I apologize for the absence of slides, and thank you for your patience. And again, feel free to give me a call anytime. And thanks for your interest in my work. I really appreciate it.
And so please, since you have the slides, if you could send it to me so that we can post it on the BIS website, that would be very, very helpful.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
of course, this session is recorded. So, and I think
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if I sent you the privacy notice documents or even the copyright document, but if I have not done so, just email me and I'll forward it to you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you
Thanks
very
much.
much. Have a very nice Friday afternoon.
And good weekend to everyone. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. And for the virtual audience online, this will be the final session for the first BCI conference at DOC. And thank you for attending. And hopefully, if we get a chance, I don't know, maybe the week or two from now, if we send out a survey, we hope to have you participate in the survey as well, or give us some feedback. Thank you very much. Have a nice Friday afternoon. And the session is stopped, I guess.